All right, we're live. Hello, ngHouston. We've got Justin Schwarzenberger talking about components. And Justin, I'm just going to go ahead and pass it over to you and let you get started. Oh, wait, let me introduce the panel. We got Brandon, we got Denny, we got Keith, we got Reggie, we got Sam, and I'm Bonnie. And this is Justin.
Hey, how's it going? Hope everybody's doing well out there. Are you seeing me? Yeah, cool. Okay. How's it going? Cool to be part of this use group meetup. That's pretty excited to talk about component architecture and some of the challenges we face and some of the concepts we face. I can give you kind of a rundown of myself for those of viewers that don't know me or a group that don't know me. I just recently spoke at NgConf on a talk called Embrace Component Tranquility. Actually, I think you're probably all seeing me see me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we got you.
So I need to use something, I don't know, that's probably fine, right? You don't have the caption windows thing going on, do you?
No, we don't. We just see your camera. You're cool. Yeah,
Okay,
Denny
cool.
actually saw that. I think Denny was the one that asked me to get you on here because he didn't make it to NgConf and he saw that talk and thought you were pretty cool, so he wanted you to talk more about that. And then Keith had a request too, didn't you, Keith? You're the one who wanted him to throw in.
Yeah, the playground for Angular looks like a really cool tool.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk today about, we're going to have a discussion around component architecture and talk about some of the challenges that come up, and we can do some questions. Hopefully I can answer some stuff and some of these things that come up as we build out components within Angular. And then we'll also make some time. I'll pull up the playground and kind of give a demo of how that application works. It's basically an application drop-in module for, you can put into your Angular projects to work components in isolation and kind of do the dev work in isolation for these components, and allow you to kind of discover a bunch of things, but also work them. So we'll kind of check that out too. But quickly about me, I recently talked at NgConf. I did a talk called Embrace Component Tranquility. It was all about the component tax that we want to identify in terms of when we componentize in Angular and some of the things that we can do to mitigate those taxes that come up and approach how we need to think about architecting applications in Angular when everything is part of this component tree and everything's really based on these components down. I'm also the host of Angular Air, a weekly video cast where we talk about all things Angular. We get a bunch of guests coming on. It's about an hour-long show every Tuesday, and we always have great topics and panelists and guests and stuff like that. So yeah, so let's talk component architecture. Basically, like I said, my talk was all about identifying these taxes that we pay. Like we in Angular, everything starts with, we bootstrap a component, and then we have this component tree, and we build out the tree of these components for our application. And there's a lot of cool things about that, right? We get this isolation when we build these components out. We can scope styles to our components. We get the markup there. We get this logic isolated to them. So it's really easy to start to fall in love with them and start doing them all over the place. A lot of that because that's the whole paradigm of building in Angular, right? Is this just component tree? But as Angular started to come into alpha and beta, I started really thinking a lot about is that a good thing to do? Is it a good thing to just kind of componentize everything? Or should we slow our roll a bit and think maybe, should I do it here? Should I do it there? And then kind of try to identify, well, what is the price that we pay when we do that, right? When we go and we build components, every component that we build is not just HTML and CSS and the scripting that we put in there, but it's also like gets built down into these little bits that Angular needs to know to do its component thing everywhere. So it's not like we're just writing HTML and CSS and some scripting, and then that's the only price that we pay. We actually pay for each component we make with a little bit more with that, right? And then the whole bootstrap and loading process, there's all those things that come into play. There's just a lot of things. They're not a ton of costly taxes, but they're there, right? And they're things that we should be mindful of and think about when we go to, say, take a list that we want to apply some logic to render out individual items, and maybe not be so quick to just jump in and make each item its own component and then componentize things within that item. Maybe we can think about different ways to do that. And one of the things I kind of want to talk about now is during this conversation is really this concept of what we end up doing. I think what I've seen what we end up doing is start thinking about there's stuff in our layouts, and specifically right now kind of addressing web layouts, right? And for the web and for the browser. And we're thinking about HTML markup. And, we come up with these challenges that we need to build this UI or this display in a certain way with this chunk that we need to apply some logic to. And maybe in the past, stuff like jQuery or any type of other like knockout or whatnot, we may have gone into that and gone, okay, now it's really just, I need to apply some conditional logic, or maybe you do server-side stuff, right? Like with .NET or PHP or something, and you're putting these conditions around this markup and displaying chunks here or there, or getting data to it here or there. And our inclination is like, okay, that we need to do that, right? We want to do that. We need to do that for this UI that we're building out. But we're in this component world, so we're like, oh, well, the component allows us to do that, so let's make a component. And then let's do an ngIf or some of the template syntax that we have around it. But then we quickly gravitate towards applying components to apply that logic to that markup to accomplish the things that we need to do for our UI. And I kind of look at that right now as going, maybe that's something that we need to kind of approach in a different manner, in like understanding the price of all these things that we pay for this component tax, and then deciding what solution maybe fits best for these different scenarios. So we can be highly performant, we could be, semantically correct, and all these other things that go into this web development ecosystem that we're accustomed to and we want to, try and shoot for. And how do we accomplish that within this component tree scenario that we've got with Angular? And I think some of these things that we can start to identify is like there's opportunities to use templates and template outlets within your component. So let's say you have a list component that's going to render a list of items and an individual item for list and kind of detail, right? And we quickly gravitate towards making a detailed component for each of those. And now we have this another leaf node in our tree of components. But we could make use of like templates and template outlets, and within the list component, just say, okay, this is what represents the markup for an individual item. Now ng4 over that in here, and not have to pay any additional cost for additional components, sort of thing. So, but there's give and takes on that, right? I mean, maybe you get this benefit, when you isolate these components. We've got this style encapsulation that Angular provides out of the box for this shim to do our styling scope to our individual components. So maybe you have a benefit of making those individual detailed components be their own, detailed chunks be their own component, because now you can scope your styling to it, and maybe that's a better fit than having all your styling rules for the list and the item up here. So it's like give and take and trade-off, but I think it's really important for us to understand and know that and accept that really when we're building with Angular, we're component architects, and we need to think that way, and we need to understand the tools that are there and the costs that we pay as we do these different architectures, and then just apply what fits and what's right for that different scenario. Kind of talking a lot. Why don't anybody go ahead and jump in, and you got any questions or points that you want to hit on while I'm talking about this stuff? Go for it.
I have a question. So, what is the ultimate end goal when you say you're trying to be a component architect?
Well, I think that it's part of a product of Angular because of the fact that like we're bootstrapping a component to begin with. We bootstrap our app component, and then everything from there is part of this component tree, right? So it's baked into the platform that we're using. So now we need to start thinking about, well, that's a requirement. So how do we want to handle these scenarios? And I think one thing that comes up is it becomes difficult, I feel, to apply one pattern to your application that you're building like throughout, right? Like maybe you do a detailed presentation pattern where you have a parent component that's going to handle loading all the data for you and just pass it down into presentation components that are just going to display that data, handed it through inputs and outputs. And that pattern works really well, but sometimes it doesn't work for other scenarios. It's not the most ideal for certain scenarios. So now you have to do a different pattern there. And I think a lot of people start to want to identify a pattern and apply it across the board to their app. So there's like this consensus, makes it easy. I'm just going in, I'm building a new slice of my app. I'm going to do it the same way I've done it with all these other ones. But you start to run into, as you apply this pattern over here, and you're like, I need a new little feature for that particular tool. All of a sudden, that pattern really is not the most ideal. It works, and you can make it work for what you're trying to accomplish in that tool, but maybe there's a better way, and so you end up wanting to really pick the best architecture for these little sub pieces that you're doing to make the most effective app. And because of that, then you know, as a developer in Angular, you kind of just have to understand this architecture and think about it in an architect way for each of these scenarios that come up, and know, like, the platform of Angular gives us this tool set of ways to build out in this component world, and it's about kind of grabbing the right tool for each view or each piece that you're building, and build it the most effectively with those tools. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yes, it does.
I have a question. Do you have, and I think you touched on this at ngConf, and I was sleep deprived, and so if you go over it again, I would be very happy. So I think that you mentioned, like, there's like almost like a threshold of when, and for those of us watching on YouTube, if you guys have questions, you can put them in the chat too. I forgot to say that earlier. So I think you mentioned like a threshold, like if you've got a bunch of code going on, you've got your template, right, that you might not necessarily want to break out all these pieces, even though it's sometimes you kind of get fun. Like when I first started with Angular, I was like ng this and ng that, and because I was having fun, right? So I ng'd everything. So you can get carried away, but like obviously if your code is repeated, if you have one element that you're using in other places, you would want to break that out into a component. But then the other guideline would be what, like, if it triggers an event or if there's something dynamic changing on there, that would be like, is there like a guideline maybe for when this should be its own component?
Yeah, I kind of start to look at it and go, okay, I want to contain behavior. And I had a great talk with Taras a bit ago from the Ember community, and we paired up for a day, for a couple hours during the day, and he really went through how they approach it in the Ember community and building components. It was really cool to see, because one of the things they do a lot is like think in terms of behavior for the component. So like you want to isolate some behavior, not so much of applying it or isolating chunks of markup and stuff, but actually like behavior. And it's like, okay, this particular thing is going to, I want to use that same behavior in multiple places. And we get that with directives, right? There's a lot of that behavior that we do. We apply behavior with the directives. And I think we kind of do the same thing with components. But some of the things I like to think about is I look at it and go, okay, well, first off, semantically from the markup, right? Like if I'm going to want to render something with a UL and an LI, do I really want to make a component for the contents in that LI? And now I've got this, because each time we do a component, we have, typically, we write a element selector for our components. And so we end up making this custom element that we put our component in, and we've just added another container in our DOM for that particular thing. We kind of gravitate towards doing that. But when we build our components, we could actually build them with other type of selectors. We can do attribute selectors and class selectors. So we could actually target existing elements, DOM elements, rather than custom elements, and kind of not have to worry about these containers and stuff like that. So there's ways with that to now apply almost behavior and logic to existing DOM elements as we sculpt that thing out.
That's actually a really good point, because we lost the replace in Angular 2, right? So now we used to have an option that we could replace whatever element we were in, but we can't do that anymore. So now you have, because I know I broke some CSS like that one time, because I split something out into a component and then I had another div, and so my CSS was kind of. We have a question over here. John Burns wants to know. He said, we have a ngGrid loading a huge chunk of data over 10 megabytes. The whole app is built assuming no lazy loading. What would you recommend to refactor to support lazy loading to avoid a rewrite? That's a good question, John.
So I'm assuming grid, like a kind of table layout sort of deal, information probably. And I kind of started to gravitate towards Austin, one of my friends and the panelists on Angular Air, who has this data table library, NgRx data table. And I'm assuming that that's what we're talking about. I don't know if we can get an answer on that, but rows of data and sort of thing like that, and just a lot of information. And he's taken a pretty good approach to optimizing that and thinking about that in terms of loading chunks of it, swapping out and doing type of like a infinite scroll sort of thing, where you're only really dealing with the data that's in the viewport, and it's keeping track of as you go up and down, like to bring in more data and to remove and replace DOM elements and stuff like that. I think in terms of, you know, if you've got one big data set, you're going to probably end up doing something like that in terms of manipulating the layout and you know, doing stuff with templates and stuff like that, as opposed to lazy loading stuff, unless you're using like routes for those individual chunks.
It sounds like he's got the same issue that I had, because I ran into this exact same problem a while back. I had a huge data set, and I'm trying to put it all, and so there's like this big lag, and especially before I learned about watchers, right? You remember that Sasquatch, Scott Moss had a Sasquatch talk, and you had to learn about and then Kenzie Dodds had a really cool little tool out. It was like to tell you how many watchers you had and how many items you had, and that was cool. But yeah, it was difficult because it was this huge data set. But that's exactly what I did. What you mentioned was the infinite scroll, which is exactly what I would recommend, John, because when I had this problem, that's how I solved it, was the infinite scroll. So what happens is it's going to load a little bit. It's basically only going to load on the DOM what you can see, and then it'll kind of preload the next as you scroll. It's gonna actually load a chunk at a time, and it'll be smooth. And there are, you said what was it? Austin's NgRx will do that. ngGrid might do that. But yeah, there are tools out there that will handle that for you. So you should look into infinite scrolling. And I don't know if that answers your question. There's a little bit of a delay between the video and the chat, but I'm sure John will pop up again in a minute. But yeah, that's a good point. I like that infinite scrolling.
Yeah, and you know, if you have to build infinite scrolling on your own, it's pretty challenging. It's not a fun endeavor to do. There's a lot of complications in that, right? Yeah, it's really about, you know, it's two-part. I think it's handling that load of that data and only, you know, and requesting chunks of it at a time. But then it's also handling the view of that and optimizing how you do the swap out of the DOM most effectively, right? Because that's when you're really going to start, even with infinite scroll, you'll start to feel this pain with the speed and stuff. If you're not, you know, that's the second part of the equation, is to figure out how to optimize taking and displaying these chunks in and out of the DOM, right? And reusing pieces and stuff like that. So, but yeah, if NgGrid doesn't have that, check out ngx-data table. I know the source code has a bunch of stuff that it does really well with that, so they can get some inspiration from that.
I had that pain the first Angular app that I did. It was like back in 2013, and I just learned Angular, and I didn't know anybody else in the whole world who was using Angular at that time. I mean, there were a lot of people. I didn't know any of them, right? And I made this app, and it had, you know, data. We had a table, and it would sort, and we had like checkboxes, and we could sort and filter everything, and it was really cool. In development, it was really cool. And I had, you know, fake data, and yeah, it was amazing. It was like instant. As soon as you start typing, it would just, you know, sort. And then when we moved it to production and everything was done, right, we went to move it to production, and we had about 5,000 rows of data. And I had like 20 rows of data in development, and it was awesome, but 5,000 rows, and it just hung. The whole page took like a minute to load. And my client's like, what are you going to do to fix that? And I was like, I don't know how to fix that. I'm still learning. But yeah, it ended up being infinite scroll.
Yeah, and you know, I think that's another thing, that these are part of the equation that we need to think about in terms of componentizing all the things and stuff, right? Because I could totally see that you can get to a point where you make a bunch of components, right, for everything, and then you load it up with a bunch of data and a bunch of big giant display, and now all of a sudden all those little taxes are accruing, right? And you're feeling the pain of them all going, the same sort of concept, right? So you start thinking about, well, what is, you know, Angular has to do some work to deal with the components, right? Versus just working with the template code. So yeah, I think those things can potentially add up. So we just need to be mindful of those and go into this approach and say, okay, let me think about these scenarios and these equations. The same data table type of scenario. I mean, you really want to think about that same sort of thing when you go to make your components, you know. But at the same time, you know, as I started getting into thinking about this, a while back, like I really wanted to tell people like, slow your roll on componentizing. Don't do it so much. But there's so many good reasons to make components. I like, okay, how can I find this happy medium where it's like, I don't have to train or tell anybody, you know, don't componentize or slow down componentizing. Componentize everywhere you think that you want to componentize that's going to be beneficial. Just understand the cost that you pay to do it, and then make smart decisions on whether or not it's worth it to do that or not, right?
Can you actually talk, because you mentioned the cost, like the component tax, right? Can you talk just for a minute about specifically, like the thing that I ran into was it wraps in a div and you don't have that replace option anymore. So you're going to have a div, and if you have a bunch of CSS that's already written and it's all nested very nice and neatly in your SaaS, right? If you move that out, you're going to have a package or a containing div tag that can be a pain. But if you put it in an attribute in a class, you can get around that. But what are some of the other taxes that you mentioned?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just run them down. The first ones are couple ones that we pay with just building with Angular, right? So it's just part of the cost of admission, and that's okay because we get this awesome stuff that we get with the Angular platform. But understand the price that we pay for those, right? And that's the payload tax and the execution tax. And the payload tax is really this. When we build a component, it's not just the markup, CSS, and logic, but it's also the little bits that Angular needs to do its component thing, right? And then the execution tax is really like, it's got to bootstrap all the components that are in our ng module that we're targeting, and run those and process those, right? So those are two things that there's some small tax in there versus just building some markup and some scripting right in the DOM. But that's okay because we get all this awesomeness with it, right? But just understanding that those are there, right? And then, you know, and one of the ways, you know, we talk about lazy loading and this approach that now getting our bundle sizes down and splitting our code up and stuff like that. I mean, these are all kind of part of a product of the fact that we've got this, all of our stuff is in these JavaScript files, right? That's how it's getting delivered. I mean, depending on how you do your styles and how you do things like that. But like, let's say you do your styles using just the shim that comes out of the box with Angular. Now your CSS is part of that JavaScript that gets delivered in that bundle versus a script tag that you know, can load, the browser can load at a different time or whatnot. So it's something we need to think about, right? But again, those are just part of the baked in stuff, and we pay that tax because we get this awesomeness. So then what you're mentioning, which is the container element tax, and that's this concept of when we build out components and we just jump right to using custom elements as our selectors for our components, we automatically take on the fact that we need to put that container element in our other parent components in order to use this thing. And with that container element, a lot of the pain or the challenges come with the styling, right? Just like you're saying, because now you've got another tier in there in your tree, so that can disrupt things. But you also have these custom elements that don't have a display block by default. So now it's like if you want to style based on those and have spacing and everything taken up with those, you now have to add that. So every time you're using these custom element selectors and you want to have that as part of your, you know, like a display block on that, now you're putting that everywhere. And when you put that in the components, like if you use :host selector in your components to put that in there and you're using the native shim, now you're adding to the CSS, which adds to the components JavaScript, which bundles up and is duplicated. And so they just add up, right? Small minor cost, but it's there. And then the other thing, it kind of keeps us from, you know, this golden point of semantic markup, right? I mean, some cases it's good, but other cases we end up going and saying like the list item, right? Maybe you want to use a UL and a LI for your lists and details. And it'd be ideal if you could just have your LI and leverage that, or you know, these native elements that you want to leverage that semantically declare what you're using, or article and aside and header and footer sort of thing. But we can do that by making these attribute selectors or class selectors or a combination of those and target those existing DOM elements. So now we can, you know, leverage more of that native semantic markup as we build out our views. And, you know, part of that comes into play when we go to debug and develop and working our stuff as web developers in the browser, right? And we're looking, we're inspecting the source of it, and we're seeing what's going on, and we're digesting that in our dev tools. And it's a lot easier to be looking at the semantic markup and figuring out where things are going on than to see just a ton of these container elements everywhere that now you kind of almost have to decipher of what's the structure that's supposed to be going on in there, sort of thing. So I don't know. So that would be the next one.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because I've had sometimes projects where I'm working on code that someone else wrote who's no longer working there or whatever, and I have to kind of dive down and find, and then I go here, and then I got to open another file, and then I go here and I got to open another file and kind of chase it down, and it can get kind of crazy. So you want to have a good reason. We have another question in the chat. Richard wants to know, is the component tax basically object hierarchy and lifecycle baggage? Which would be, yeah, right?
Yeah, so I think the next one, which is the tree coupling tax, kind of plays right into that, right? It's this concept that we're building out in this component tree. So you start with a parent component and you just go leaf nodes out from there, right? And we take this something like a decision presentation pattern where we build a parent component that's responsible for loading all the data. And then we have these presentation components that are children of it, that we basically hand down data via inputs and wire up to click events and stuff like that via outputs, so that this decision component up at the top can make all the data changes and stuff like that. We end up making this coupling of this tree, right? And as we do that, and we build out more depth in there, now we end up having to do like this pass through. We got to send data down through this pipe. We got to broker these outputs back up through this pipe, and you end up getting these intermediary components that are just, all they're doing is passing through stuff. So now you got extra code and logic in there to pass these things through, that sort of thing. So then we quickly want to solve that with something like services. And so we go, okay, we make a service that this thing can get injected into it. This child component could get injected in a service, and it can handle calling that service to get the data it needs or to broker action to that thing. And now we can kind of break that chain a bit, right? But then we get in another coupling scenario, because now we've got these different components throughout here that could be relying on a service. And as that service changes or needs to be different, then that could affect the fragility of that. And so then we start thinking about state management across our app and something like Redux pattern, and say, okay, well, now we have a central store that manages our state and everything can just react to it, right? And now we can really kind of have this component here and this component here react on the same data and get updates pushed to them. Now there's not this, there's less of coupling, so that becomes a solution as well. But then there's trade-offs with that too. And so I think it's the big thing that I keep facing with building out in this component world is thinking about how to build each of these different scenarios that fits the best, that's easy to maintain over time. That I think one of the biggest challenges that I've seen is crafting a tool or a view and picking a pattern to do that in, this component architecture pattern to do it in, and it feels perfect and it feels like a great fit. And then the day comes that you add another feature to that thing. And all of a sudden the feature that you add with this component that needs to do something, in a different manner, all of a sudden makes that architecture not as ideal. And now you have to change the architecture to fit the new scenario, the combination with the new scenario. And another challenge with that is that this other scenario will work, but I guess it's really anything that we develop in the web or anything in software in general, I guess, that you can always make something work, but whether or not it's ideal or clean or efficient or easy to maintain over time, those sort of things play out.
You know what, the trouble that I had, and I thought it was really clever, right? And I still kind of struggle with this a little bit, which plays into component architecture. But so what I want to organize my components. Basically, my first instinct is to break them down by sections, right? I have a dashboard section, I have a profile section, I have a chat section, or whatever, right? I have these different basically pages in the single page application, and then maybe I would have like a dashboard folder. And then underneath that, I might have specific components that are used on the dashboard, and I would just put those in the dashboard folder, which works great right up until the moment when I want to reuse a component on a different page. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, well, where do I put it? Because it's like it's broken down by pages. So then I almost want to have another folder for components, but then all my pages are components, and then and then I kind of get confused. I confuse myself. So how would you respond to that? How would you handle that? Solve my problems, Justin.
Okay, let's try and see if I can solve it. I like to take this concept of global components, right? These shared components that you're going to use across features. So kind of what you're talking about is having, feature folders for individual tools or pages or whatever you want to define as different features, right? And those have components and this composition of components that are specific to that individual tool, right? Or that individual feature. And it's going to be different for this feature than this feature. But now you start to identify these common components that are used across features. And so now you need to really kind of elevate those up and put them in some other shared library or some concept like that. And you can certainly go about it by making a separate library that you have just like a component library, ends up something like material or things like the NgRx data table and stuff like that. And you're like, okay, I'm going to put these into the thing that I could use across different apps. But maybe you're not planning to build other apps, right? This is just the one app with these multiple features. Well, you could elevate that into, similar to like a feature folder, but like a shared folder, right? And it becomes a shared module. And now you put components in there that you're going to reuse across your different features. Similar to how the common module is used, and we get all of our directives, ngIf, ngFor, and we bring that common module into our different ng modules so that we can make use of those common things that we want to make available in these different features. And we do kind of the same sort of thing with our components. Let's say we have a avatar details component that we know is used across these different tools, put that in this shared module, and then architect it in a way that's free of any type of coupling or dependencies upon things. So maybe I like to think about these global components as making use of inputs and outputs decorators, and really not taking in any services or any other type of dependencies, so that you can move them around really easily and use them in these different features without having to run into these scenarios or these challenges that come up. So like this address or this avatar details component, it could have an input for the avatar, the username, and then input for the URL for the avatar image, right? And maybe has an output for a click event that then you could use in feature A over here to send it in the data and wire it up. And when you click on that, it maybe launches a modal, right? And in feature B, you wire up the click event for that to actually navigate to another display screen or something like that. But I think part of the key there is really to understand that, like, when you want to move those components into this global space, you really need to end up making sure that you make them as decoupled as possible, because you're going for reuse at that point, right? You're not doing this composition of components, you're doing this reusability of components. And so you really, you put a service in there, you make it dependent upon a service. Now, anywhere you use it, you have to obviously make sure that service has been provided, right? Or else it'll break down. And so those are the things I like to focus on when I elevate those components to like a shared or global scenario.
Reminds me of an architect that I worked with a couple of years ago, Jim. Shout out to Jim, who drove me nuts when we worked together, but he actually made me a better developer because he was a pain in the butt. And I would make something right, and he's like, Bonnie, this is really cool. We want to use this in other departments, but this variable right here is hard coded, and so so you need to not and I was like, so then I would have to like go back and figure out how to feed that in and not hard code it. But it was stuff like that where basically anything that we would elevate as a common component or a shared component, we don't want anything hard coded in there. It should just pass through smoothly without, whatever it is needs to be an input or an output.
Right. Something that's interesting there too is now we start thinking about the API for our components, right? When you build this shared component or this global component, you need to start thinking about how are people going to use it. And when we talk about that, we talk about how are they going to send it input data? How are they going to wire up to the output? What's the API signature for that component? And when we talk about like this avatar component that needs a username and the URL for the image, well, do we make two inputs, one for each of those, and then the user of that component needs to wire up to two inputs in their template for those individual pieces? Or do we have one input called model, and we provide, maybe we're using TypeScript, and we provide an interface that we export from that global component. This avatar component has an avatar interface that has those two properties on it, that somebody over here as an implementer could implement that interface on their data and pass it in as one input, of all that data in. And then now, that can become handy because let's say that avatar component now needs two more properties, right? Well, you just apply that to that interface and that model, and now you don't have to load up your DOM with all these input bindings on the thing. They have just the one input binding. So maybe that's more of a cleaner API that you want for your component. But now you need to start thinking about that. Same way with the outputs, right? Like what do we want to report back from this component that action was taken in it? What do we need to broker back out, right? And how do we broker back out? Do we give back, I mean, do we just have like if we want to do a click, right, on this avatar component, and so we have this custom element for this avatar component, and inside of it somewhere, and maybe we only want to have the name clickable. So we need to have an output on our avatar component to say, oh, somebody took the action of clicking on this thing, right? So we wire up our DOM element that has the name, you know, maybe it's a span or something. We wire up the click event to that to emit the output event emitter from our new component, their avatar component. And now somebody over here as an implementer would wire up to the, you know, avatar on click sort of thing and wire that up. But do we send back information? Does that API, should we send back something through the output on the event value that gets sent back, or does it not need it? Is it just something that somebody just needs to know that action was taken and they can handle it over here? So start thinking about those things and this whole API of our components and how other implementers, you know, the other people that are using it, what's going to be the best story for them. And it's similar to anything that we build in programming when we think about functions or classes or anything like that. We're always kind of thinking about that signature.
I feel like when we start talking about inputs and outputs and passing things through components, it's like we could just like almost fall over and segue into NgRx, because I've just started looking. I know NgRx has been around for a while, but I started looking at it and I'm like, that's cool. I really think that's cool, and I want to kind of start playing with that a little bit more. I've just barely started getting into it, but that whole passing inputs and outputs and everything is a stream. I was watching Rob talking about that the other day, and I'm kind of like, I need to go get Brandon and Sam, or Brandon and Mike, and get them on here one day. Did you meet them at NGConf?
Yeah. And Mike's been on the Angular, and he's going to come back on. I think they're getting ready for a new release of that, and so he was talking about coming on and kind of promoting that maybe in May.
Yeah, Keith and I were talking about that.
You know, one of the things I kind of tell people with that is that I think it's sold in the wrong way. If you want to market it, you know, identify it in the wrong way. Everybody talks about it being managing your application state and stuff like that, and the flow of things and stuff. But I think what it really does is it allows you to decouple your component architecture, and that's really the strong benefit. So as you start going down these roads of detailed presentation and all these other things and tying things in with these inputs and outputs, just like you mentioned, it becomes apparent that's like you need some other solution for that, right? And when that moment hits, that's when this NgRx and Redux and that sort of pattern starts to click. I mean, I think people start to realize, oh, that's what it can solve, right? Because you just jump into it and go, well, I'm going to manage my application state. Well, what does that mean? And like, what are the benefits to that? Like, is it just this complicated thing? And how do I start thinking about, okay, well, I've got application state, like, is this thing open or closed? But then I also have data that's, you know, is that part of my application state? I have, you know, this customer that I'm viewing right now, and then this list of customers, is that all stuff that stores in this application state? And so it gets confusing, right, of how do you attack that? But then when you kind of start to see how it can solve things, what it can be used for to accomplish this decoupling, that's, I think, when the clarity comes in there, is going, oh, okay, that's, yeah, totally, I can get it now. Like I could have two views here, and I could have, you know, this tool over here. At some later day, I decided to build a new tool, and I want to have some action in there that affects this display in my shell or something, right? Well, it's really easy to do. You could dispatch an action from that click, and now, you know, this thing's listening to subscribe and for that new data, and now that action is taken over here, and your shell of your UI changes, right? And now you're like, oh, I want to do that same thing in this new other tool over here. I can plop that in. I don't really have to worry about how to communicate component to component. I use the store and the state to do that, and that becomes really powerful, and it starts to solve some of these problems.
So just to make sure I'm clear on this, I'm just going to probably repeat back to you what you just said. So because when I'm thinking, you know, I'm thinking about state, and the problem that I was thinking about this earlier was, like, you have components, you have nested components, and if you get a larger application, you might end up with a component inside of a component inside of a component inside of a layer. Like you have these layers, the tree, right? And so the way that I'm used to thinking about it is you're going to have to pass that data from one component to another all the way down. But with state, you might go like 3 levels down, and there's something nested inside of a thing, but somewhere we know that this user is logged in and that this user has some permissions and can see certain. So whatever we want to do, we're going to have an ngIf somewhere inside of like 3 levels in, that we don't have to pass that and waterfall it each way. We can just grab it from the state. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And then with NgRx, you can get slices of the state, right? So you can grab the store and then request, this is the slice that I want for this component, and that's what I care about. So subscribe me to that, and I will get updated anytime that changes. So, if you have if you have something that like, okay, did they log in, right? Like you got the shell and you're like, they're not logged in, and they're looking at something and something's not displayed, and they go up to the shell and they log in, and it dispatches an action that, oh, they're logged in now, then this thing could be subscribed to when they're logged in, and as soon as that action takes place and changes the state, then this will flip and show the information that you wanted, right? And so now you have this, I want to do something over here, but I want this to change over here. How do I get them to, do I do this event system broker and couple them? No, I just dispatch an action over here, and this one is just listening to the store and saying, I want to listen to this slice of the state in the store, and I want to get fed updates as that thing changes. And so now it's really easy to piece those things together and do that sort of thing.
That's pretty. I just have started kind of understanding and looking more, and I think Reggie started it. Reggie and he was like, "Hey Bonnie, are we going to do any RxJS stuff anytime soon?" And I'm like, "Why?" And he was like, "It's cool." So, and we made Reggie do a presentation, and then I started learning about RxJS. And next thing I know, I was like, "Ooh, I need to use RxJS for this." And then I started kind of getting into and I was telling Sam, I almost tweeted. I felt like it was a stupid question. I didn't want to retweet. I didn't want to tweet it, but it was like, there's NgRx, and I kept hearing NgRx, and I kept hearing RxJS. And at first I was thinking they were the same thing, and then I started to kind of understand more and get more interested in like, are they like 2 different products that do the same thing, or they like build on top of each other? And so I'm kind of starting to learn about that more. And I think that's pretty cool stuff. So Mike and Brandon, if you're listening, we're coming for you. You're going to have to get on the panel pretty soon. That's pretty cool. Hey, speaking of panel, do you guys have any questions? We need you guys to pipe in.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to know, what do you think are some misconceptions of components that you see devs typically make?
Misconceptions of components. I think that the one with the container element is a big one. I think that people, because a lot of our training, a lot of our teaching, a lot of our examples out there are all about making a custom element, right, for your component. And so you just make a new component, use generator to do so or whatnot, and bam, you're into taking on a custom element at that point, and you just roll with it and you roll with it, and it seems natural, it seems like the thing to do, right? But I think that a lot of people probably don't know about it or don't keep it in their mind that like they don't have to do that. They can apply component logic and component layout and things like that to an existing DOM element. So I think that's one potential misconception about it. I think some of the other ones I see are around the thought of embracing the styling scoping. And I think a lot of people, well, I don't know if a lot of people, but people will kind of want to gravitate towards global styling and keep what they're used to, in the sense, and when I talk about that, I talk about like turning off the emulated mode that Angular has for the styling, so that the styles don't get scoped automatically with the shim to your component and the markup that's within it, so that they can use stuff that they're used to, like have a global style sheet that has, like a BEM syntax or something like that then they work with in these components, and they're not this scoping. But there's a lot of power in this shim that we've got with Angular out of the box to be able to really isolate our CSS to components the same way we isolate our logic to components, right? And our behaviors to components. So we can really start to get in, and as we craft components, we can write style rules around targeting just native DOM elements like a div, or we could have a simple class called selected, and we could use that same class name in all these other components, and they won't collide because we've got the shim that's going to add this unique attribute to that selector when it goes to do its component thing. And so I think that some people are a little bit shy to start using that, or they want to gravitate towards the other, but I would encourage people to explore it and feel what that's like. The same way with, like, I think that one of the things you can do with that is you can now start to think about these simple names, or even targeting existing DOM elements with that shim, that you don't have to write so much complex naming conventions around your CSS because you have the scoping. So I think that's another thing that people don't dive into.
I've got a question on this topic, Justin. So one of the things that I'm exploring a bit right now in an app I'm building is to have user-defined color themes for the application. And so I've been struggling a bit with finding the right balance of encapsulation for the CSS on the components to actually get that to work properly. You have any tips for handling that?
Yeah, actually one of my friends, Brian Treese, he did a course on Pluralsight about doing styling within Angular applications and patterns and practices that you can do on that. And some of that is a combination of things like making use of host context to identify, I don't know if you're familiar with the host, or people are familiar with the host context selector, but you basically can utilize that on your components to say, hey, look, if there's a class or this selector that I'm targeting that's either on my component itself or anywhere up the tree, then I can style against that, right? So that's one approach to theming and stuff like that, is you can say, look, if somebody else, if the implementation over here is to put a class on here called, you know, large or called highlighted or whatever, my component can say, oh, well, if I have highlighted on me or anywhere up the tree, I'll style it this way. If I don't, I'll style it that way. So that's one way to kind of allow people to put that class somewhere up the tree that then this thing can adapt to that.
Whose Pluralsight course was that?
It's I'll have to pull it up here. Let's see. Well, I can get a link.
Yeah, tweet it, and copy ngHouston, and then we'll retweet it.
Okay.
And Austin's NgRx too.
Okay,
We'll do that later.
And so another thing would be making use of CSS properties. And so depending on what browsers you're targeting, if you're targeting evergreen browsers, I believe just recently Microsoft Edge now supports them. So I think our main evergreen browsers support that. And by evergreen, anybody's not familiar with that, it's these browsers that update automatically for us. So we're always on the latest version. So Chrome, Firefox, Microsoft Edge, those are considered evergreen browsers, meaning that we can be confident that everybody out there who's running those are probably getting the latest version. So that things that are available in those, we can be confident about building for. So if your target for your application is those, then you could start looking at using CSS properties. And that's probably the most, I don't know, my favorite flavor of that, because it allows you to now say, okay, I'm going to have these properties in my component that somebody could set from upstream and drive the different looks and whatnot of my component. So those would be the things that I would recommend looking at for that. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, it at least gives me some areas to dig a little deeper into. CSS properties is a little foreign to me, so I'll have to check that out. Thanks.
Okay.
Keith, are you giving them like a number of palettes to choose from, or do they get to customize, like how far that could go? That could be simple, or that could be very, very complicated, depending on how much freedom you give them.
Right.
Absolutely,
yeah.
right.
We're still kind of figuring that out. Initially, I think we're just going to have a couple of pre-built theme options that users would be able to set for themselves. But then we're also looking at for for a particular client to allow them to implement their own theme. So they would maybe have their own theme file that would get put into their build. And,
that's the famous question. How much can you customize this? And I say,
right.
how much money do you have? We can customize this as much as you want. But that, yeah, I know. That's terrible.
That's kind of what it is, right?
We could do it.
Yeah, I think that, like, you know, if somebody wants to simple apply a theme, it would be probably like the host context approach, saying, okay, this class defines the look of this thing, and then all you have to do is throw this theme class essentially on there to implement that. And then if you want more rich customization, now you're really talking about like a CSS properties type of approach. It's like you can configure all of these ones for your theme, and then they'll just flow down, and now you've got it. So it'll probably be a combination of those.
And if you really want to be fancy, you need to give them a color picker and then come back and show it to us.
Yeah, right.
That's your challenge.
Right.
That would be pretty cool.
I got a quick
what other questions?
I have another
People aren't
question.
asking questions. You got to chime in.
Brandon's got a question.
All right, so
Sorry, Denny. Yeah, everybody's got questions.
sorry.
Yeah.
All right, so as far as architecture and like say this tax, right? So say you have, I don't know, five components, same component that you're using over your website or your app. Would it be better to use at inputs, or the inputs, or I mean, are we going more service based on those? I mean, which kind of what way would you go on that?
So I think I started thinking about in terms of what is the component in question, right? And is this a kind of a global component scenario where you want to reuse the same component in different places? I would lean towards the inputs. I kind of tend to want to lean towards the inputs as much as possible, or a state store type of deal before I go down the services route. But services are certainly a tool in the tool belt. I think one of the challenges with services is that you end up going, okay, well, I'm going to start applying this pattern. I'm going to have a service for emails, right? And now I'm going to have a service for notes. And, oh, I got the same pattern, so I'm going to have a service for quotes. And now all of a sudden I've got 3 different services that I've made because that's the pattern I'm following. And I hit a component where I'm like, I need a little bit of every of that piece of data. Now I got to inject 3 different services. And so now you start adding to that complexity and that coupling of your components when you start to bring all those in. And that's where like something like NgRx and the store starts to kind of solve some of that, is because now you got one thing you're dealing with, which is like the store, right? But the inputs and outputs are really nice because it's this easy API interface in that not only allows you to, manage that and reduce the complexity a bit of your components, but it also makes it easier to reuse those things because you can drop them here or there and they don't have that dependency. It also becomes a little bit easier to do like change detection, switch that to on push and kind of get the benefits of that and stuff like that. So I don't know, I would say that I usually try and lean towards handing data in and getting events back out of them through the inputs and outputs, and then be just wary of or aware of when you go to start injecting services into it, like what it means. And if you do go and start to do the services, then one of the things I've discovered lately is, the component metadata has a property called providers that you can provide services directly on your component metadata. And I've had that in the past, and I start to see that like that becomes difficult because at that point you're really saying this component, when it gets used, is only getting this version of that service. There's no way to replace it, to mock it, to any of that sort of thing at that point. It becomes real challenging to do that. So if I do services into my components, I want to usually register them or provide them in an NG module somewhere rather than on the component itself.
Use local storage. I don't think I'm ever going to be able to say local storage again without hearing Shy coaching Mike Brocky. No, local storage. Awesome.
I can't see Pascal without thinking about his
the mighty parrot.
That was so great.
I know. Shy's awesome. I love Shy.
Totally.
Hey, Denny, did you have a question? I thought I saw you start to chime in a minute ago.
I did, yeah. Hey, Justin, I was wondering, when you think of a container component, because I've seen a lot of examples out there, and there's a folder in the hierarchy that's called container. And I'm trying to understand, is that the place where you put a component that is responsible solely for laying out children, and it just handles the structural part? Or is it more a component that manages the data that feeds something beneath it, those children components? So what do you find? Is there delineation you make between that, whether it's just layout or it manages the data and it's responsible for that? Or do you find combining them to be helpful sometimes as well?
Yeah, awesome question. I actually got a good answer for that. It's kind of one of the things I touched about briefly at the very end of my talk was this concept of atomic design by Brad Frost, and thinking about how do we build systems of components for the web. And that's really his theory and approach with that whole concept. And what it is you start thinking about, okay, what do I have in my view, and how is that composed? And then what are pieces, like how finite do I make these individual pieces and identify these slices? Like, am I down to a molecule or an individual, like, small component, reusable component level? Am I at a composition of components, like a list detail? Am I at that level of the container and doing this stuff in there? So it's looking at what your UI is going to be and what you need to break down in terms of those pieces, and then to start architecting that, right? And so you end up going with, like, I kind of look at it and go, okay, I look at this as almost like in one app, like a page, right? I have this whole thing that's a page that represents most of the viewport, and then that's kind of like a page view. And so I know I'm going to have like a component that contains that. That's the starting part of that thing. So it's like the container. Maybe it's going to make some decision to load the data in there, maybe not. But it's really like, because, you know, we talk about the component tree, and it's kind of like this challenge to work with, but it also fits well because in HTML we have essentially the same sort of tree, right? We're going down these nodes, and we have nested nodes and nested elements and stuff like that. So it's almost the same paradigm. We look and we say, okay, for the page, you're going to have some parent element that things are going to sit in. You're going to have an article, you're going to have a div, whatever it is. So you need to have a home for that. So you start with your parent component that's going to represent this page, right? And usually following, like, if you follow the Angular style guide, Angular IO style guide, or use the Angular CLI, these patterns kind of show that you have a directory for your component. And so maybe you have a directory named container for your component or page. And in that is your component TS file and your HTML file. But now you got child components for that. So now you end up going, I kind of look at it and go, okay, whatever child components are directly under this component, I'll have in that folder folders for each of those components. So if you have a page that's going to have like a bunch of chunk around it, and then maybe that's going to have a list and detail inside of there somewhere. So I know that page is going to render the list component. So I'm going to have a list component as a folder underneath that container component. And then that list component folder, it's going to have a detail component folder underneath it, because that detail is only used for that list, right? And then as soon as I start identifying components that need to be used somewhere else within that subtree, they get moved up. So moved up to like a shared directory inside of there. So, and it's the same kind of concept with these global components and the features that we talked about earlier, feature A, feature B, feature C, and then you have a shared directory that has your global components that are used throughout each, right? So you have this container folder, you have this list folder, you have this details folder underneath that, and you decide that something in that details display is a component that you also want to use as the top level container. Now that component goes into a shared folder right underneath the container folder. So you have container, you have list folder and shared folder right next to it. And in the shared, now it becomes these components that you want to use across that view. And it's really becomes like this mini app of your overall app structure. You're just taking that same pattern and doing it on this level and down the tree in your directory structure, the same, almost same way you do it in your display structure. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, it does. Thanks. And I guess you could use the same approach even with where you would feed the data in that tree structure, right? If the data is used only at, 3 levels down, then you would enter that data at that point of your component tree as well, then, right? And if it got shared, then you would move that up to a higher level.
Yeah, exactly that. And then, you know, depending on if you use routing or not, let's say you're using routing for all these individual pieces, and as you go down the tree, you got router outlet, router outlet, router outlet, then you can leverage the resolve within the router. And I'm talking about the Angular's router that they come at, the router module that they have as part of the platform. Has the ability to resolve data for each routes. So you could write resolvers for those individual routes that render in those pieces and handle the data loading at that point as well. So let's say you have this container and a list and the details, and the container needs to have some overview information that's loaded from a service. Well, that route resolver could resolve just the data for the overview that it needs. And then this list component, for its route, could resolve the data for the list, and the details could resolve the single one for that, right? So that can play out. And that's one nice thing I like about the router. So if you're in a scenario where you're using the router, I would definitely recommend start thinking about using the writing resolvers for the router, because it pulls that load up of that data out of your components and allows it to load up not only the ability to load it before that component renders, but also the fact that now your components become simpler because they can just request the data off the route stream and not have to request it from a service and multiple services and stuff like that. So now it's easier to kind of reuse that component, to test that component, all those sort of things.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, anyone else? Questions?
Yeah, I was talking, but I was muted and I didn't know it. That last part was a little bit hard to visualize. Do you know of anywhere where we might find like a sample of that, of what you were talking about, the data off the route? Do you know if there's like a...
I do not offhand. Maybe I'll have to put something together, but I'll look and see. I can see if I can find something and share that, and then if not, I'll look at throwing something together for you guys.
Yeah,
So.
sometimes it's hard. You see the code and it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But when we're all sitting around talking, it's like, I can't really picture that. So right. Yeah, I would like to see a sample of that if you can find one. That would be cool.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's basically this pattern that you could write a route resolver, and then in your route definitions, when you're setting up your routes and the component that goes to the route or whatnot, you're basically adding this resolve, and you're saying like, this is the property, the name of the property that I want, and then here's the function that's going to do the resolving, and then that function can get handed route data, and you can load it up, and then just send back an object or send back a promise and do that. But I'll check. I
remember because I did something like that. I think that like the last project that I worked on in AngularJS before I jumped over to Angular, and I think that's one of the reasons why, because then when I jumped to Angular, then I had RxJS, and then I didn't even. So is that something that you would still use, the route resolver, or wouldn't we just handle that with observables?
Well, I think it depends on what you want to do, right? Like with the route resolver, and you can load that data up prior to the component getting rendered in the DOM and whatnot. So you have the ability to like wait for that display before you do it. So things like, if we end up doing that in the component, some of the things we end up doing is like putting ngContainer or ngIf around our display in some manner, because the component's getting rendered first and then the data is coming in, right? So the resolver allows you to say, I want to load the data first before you even render my component yet. And so that becomes handy. I haven't explored it too much yet with a mixture of NgRx and the route resolving. So I wonder how that story plays out. But
I feel like the longer we talk, the more we line up next week's ngHouston, and the week after that, and the week we're like, we could do with this all day. Yeah, that would be interesting, because I know I'm just diving into RxJS and I love it. And these observables and Angular Fire, I'm having all kinds of fun with that, right? But so I have on ng on a init, right? When I have ng on a init, I run and I get that and I subscribe, and so I have that, and it's super fast. But there's a second when that, when that first page first comes up, that it takes to go get it. It's just really quick, but it would be great to have that ready before. And I mean, it only takes a millisecond. So it sounds like having that route resolver would, even though there's just a tiny little bit of a delay, if we could cut that tiny little bit of a delay and have it pop up ready to go, then that would be, so that would probably be a good question for Ben.
Yeah.
Or Mike or Brandon.
Yeah, and that's what it's going to allow you to do, is to solve some of that, right? But I guess when we talk about NgRx and that concept of the stream, then now we have this scenario where, like, you can subscribe to the route data, like it's actually an observable that you get back. So your component can take in the activated route and subscribe to the data, and then if the data changes, you can get pushed updates to it, and that plays out in terms of like you have a list details, right? And you've got the details component is a router outlet, and so it's a sub route of the list, and the list renders 10 things, and you click on one, and then you click on another one. Well, Angular's not going to recreate that component for the details because it already has it. It's not getting a new route that changes that component. It's just getting new data or a new parameters for that route. So that's where the subscription to the data off of the activated route comes into play, because now your component stays rendered but just changes its data. Same sort of concept with the NgRx stuff with the store, but now you have this another level of two subscriptions. So how do you, in the resolver, tie into the store? And yet, if something else dispatches an action to change that data in the store, how do you get your data and your component to change if you're subscribed to the route data? I don't know, but yes, that's a good question. Bring that up.
We're gonna get some NgRx RxJS. We're gonna have some more, because I think we've just started messing around with that, and I think there's a lot more potential for coolness. So I think we're gonna have more on that. Does anybody else have questions? I'm watching the chat for the people that are watching online, and I don't see any. But also, I don't want us to talk too long, because I don't want us to forget that you were going to show us the play. I didn't even know. We didn't even talk about the playground when we were talking about doing this. And then Keith popped up and wanted you to talk about the playground, and I hadn't paid any attention to it. That's what I was saying earlier, is there's so much stuff. I got back from ngConf, and I was like, I want to learn this, I want to learn this, I want to learn this. And I hadn't even gotten around to looking at the playground yet. But now I was looking at it, and I think it's actually really cool. Oh, Alex upvotes the NgRx. Yeah, we want to learn more NgRx RxJS. So we're gonna have to dive into that. We'll have Ben Lesh come back maybe, and Mike and Brandon, and yeah, that'll be cool. So yeah, does anybody else have questions about components? Or Justin, or you want to continue on components, or you want to go talk about this playground?
If everybody's good on the components, I'm ready to show some playground. I get really excited about the playground. It's super fun. So, but if anybody else, anything else on components and stuff, let's talk about that before we move on.
One question to cap me off. Moving forward, what are some easy traps to avoid moving forward when architecting components?
Okay, so I think that the getting too many services, the services scenario, right? That's an easy one to fall into. You end up using a service within your component for some data type, right? And then you're like, well, this component also needs to display this other data type. So now I'm going to send in another service, and now it needs a third one. And so you could quickly end up with just this overabundance of injecting services into it, which it can handle and it can do, but it becomes complex and difficult to maintain over time, and then more coupling that comes into play, right? So that's certainly one thing. And with that whole providers, using the providers on the component metadata, I would suggest trying to stay away from that unless you have a reason to do that, because it becomes challenging and to be able to mock those or replace those if you need to. Let's see, other pitfalls. The change detection, I think, is a big one. One of the things that kind of come into play is you sit there and you go, okay, well, I've got this component and it's a class, so I can put properties on there and get to those in my view. And oh, now I need to check 3 properties to do this ngIf. oh, well, I got a class, I could write a function. So I'll write a function in my class that will aggregate the logic check of those, and then I'll put that in my ngIf up here, right? Or maybe I have an ng class and I'm conditionally putting a class on there, and I'm going to call this function in my component class to do so. Well, things like that would play out when change detection runs. Like, it's going to run through all of the things that you have bound in your component. So it's going to rerun those functions for those checks, even if that doesn't even play into the data that just changed, right? So now you're kind of paying a price for that. So I think be aware of that. Think about maybe before you do functions, same thing with pipes. Like, before you do functions and pipes, think about how that's going to play out with change detection, and maybe try and do more of these, property bindings and that sort of thing. That'd be another thing to be aware of. Let's see, let me think if I can think of something else. Yeah, I think those are kind of the first ones off the top of my head, right? So that help, hopefully.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was on mute. But yeah, thank you. Yeah, okay. I really appreciate it.
Sure. And then I think just like, just always be aware of that coupling that you get into. And hopefully this is something that, one of the things I talk about that excites me about the playground is when you run your components and you put these things in the playground into isolation, it really becomes apparent of what dependencies and what coupling you have of your component. Like, if you have a component that is using a service, and that service, when you go to write it, because you're building it within your application, that service lives in some other ng module, right? Because with services, I don't know if we're all familiar, but when you provide a service, as long as it's not a lazy loaded route, that service ends up becoming like in the global scope. You get a singleton of it in the global scope, right? So it really becomes available to other ng modules once this one ng module has provided it and put it within that pipe out there. So you could easily get into a scenario where you write this component and you inject a service and you're using it and it feels all great and it's in feature A, and feature A has that service, and you take this component, you move it over and you want to use it in feature B, and now all of a sudden you can't because the service that it relies on is provided in over here, and maybe that feature is not, maybe it's lazy loaded, so now that feature is not even part of the running DOM or the running logic in the browser, so it breaks down, doesn't have that. And when you put these things into the playground, you have to tell it everything that you need for that particular run of that component, just like unit testing. So if you unit test a component and it relies on things, you have to provide everything that it relies on, other directives that are nested within other components in order for you to run it, right? And so it exposes these things pretty quick. And so it's a really neat way to identify, oh man, did I couple this component out, or is it going to be easy to use, and that sort of thing. And then as soon as I want to reuse it, what other things come into play? Like, I've styled it. If I build it while it's in my app, I'm styling it to look nice in that app, wherever the container is that it's at. And then I say, oh, I want to use it over here too. And I put it over here in something that's not containing it. And all of a sudden it looks all crazy. But I didn't know that because I did all my development over here. Well, with the playground, you can write these scenarios and you can say, okay, scenario when it's 400 pixels wide and scenario when it's full width. And I can see that right away as I develop that component. And then now I know if I use it over here or over there, it's ready to go, sort of thing. So it's kind of cool. But why don't we check that out? You guys want to check that out? Everyone want to see that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So let's see about sharing my screen here.
Do I need to?
I think you might need to empower me, and then I can.
I know you usually drive these things. It's probably weird to be on the other side of the.
It's a little weird. A little weird. Let's see.
You guys, it was funny when we switched over to Google Hangouts after ngConf. I called up Justin and I was like, "Hey, Justin, will you teach me how to drive this thing?" He was like, "Yeah." So he's like showing me all the little buttons and everything. Justin's awesome.
Okay. I won't be awesome if I can't figure out how to do this on my Mac here, though. I have a separate desktop that I want to share that has it all set up. but I'm not seeing where I can do that. So maybe I'll just do this and you'll get the inception for a minute. Okay, can you see this now?
Yes.
Yes.
You see code on one side and Chrome on the other?
Yes.
Mhm.
Cool. Do you see this sharing bar or do you not see that? Everything good?
I don't think we see the sharing bar.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. Perfect.
Okay, so I've got my favorite editor of choice right now, WebStorm, over here on the right, and I've got Chrome browser here on the left. I've got this project that I just created using the Angular CLI because we love the Angular CLI, and for our ngHouston meetup here, and I installed the playground in it. So what the playground is this drop-in module for working your components and stuff in isolation. And the concept is that you have your application that has its components in it, right? And its things that and its whole build system of how it builds the components and all your dependencies and everything that it relies on. For example, if you're using SAS or less or something, you have a build system that handles that, right? And the playground needs to render your components based on your build and your scenario because it's all about your components, right, and making them display. And so this thing is built out as its own kind of like a root module. So just like you have, like in here, we have this app module, and that's our kind of our main module for our main ng module for our application. I got to be clear on that because there's modules and then there's ng modules, and we're talking about the ng module here. So that's like the main module that's going to get bootstrapped and started up and all that good stuff for our application. And so the playground has its own playground module that's basically the same sort of concept, providing this UI to bring up the components that you want to work on. And then from there, it's dynamically loading and discovering your components that you've sandboxed and bringing them into this display, bringing them in. So there's a little bit of setup that goes on to getting up and going with it. We have documentation on angularplayground.it.
Justin, you use the npm angular-playground for that?
Yes, it's yep. I believe it's just, let's see, angular-playground, yeah. And so I can install it, -d, I do it as a dev dependency because it's not something that you're going to need to provide and build out or whatnot. So you can just do it as a dev dependency in Node or npm. And so that just brings in the package, and then from there's some configuration that you have to do, trying to make this as minimal configuration as possible. But there's some things that just need to happen. But trying to figure out other ways to get even more minimal footprint in terms of setup. But documentation around the setup is up on the site angularplayground.it, so you can follow that. I'll just jump right into how we use the playground to sandbox these components and work with them. So the concept is that we've got our application. Right now, I've just got this default application, right? Out of the box, Angular CLI, I've got a component that shows the app works. And then when I run Playground, you're basically you're serving up another instance of an application with its own index file. So I've got this set up. Actually, I guess I'll show it a little bit here. So this is the source. This font in the menu here on the left side is kind of small, but we've got our source app, our basic general source folder that Angular CLI sets up. Comes with an index file that's the landing page of our application, and then the main TS file, which handles bootstrapping the Angular application for us, right? And with the Playground, what we're really wanting to do is we just basically want to run an instance where instead of bootstrapping the app module, we want to bootstrap the Playground module. And that gets us into running the Playground. And we can run these things side by side with our application. So the Angular CLI supports configuration for having multiple applications, something relatively new that they've got in here. So you can actually define, so what I've done in here is I have the default one that's defined for my app that does all of these inclusions of all these different pieces to do the build process and all that good jazz. And then I've defined one for Playground, which basically uses all the same stuff that the app uses, except for the index and the main, I'm using my own index file, my own main file that I've created in a folder called Playground. And so all I needed to do was I created a new index file. I don't even need to do this. I could use my existing index file, and Playground will know how to swap out your root component for, or your custom element for your application with the Playground one. But you can also create your own index file. And if you want to make it look a little nicer, loading or whatever, it allows you to do sort of that sort of thing. So I've got this index file that's got an AP root custom element, which is Angular Playground's root. And then I've got a main TS, which looks real similar to my other main application TS, except I'm bootstrapping the Playground module instead. And the Playground module, or the Playground has a CLI interface that it provides that you're going to run, and I can go in here and I can go in my package.json file, and I've actually set up another script called serve:p, and I'm going to run the Playground CLI, which is Angular-Playground. And what that'll do is that'll auto-discover an Angular Playground config file that I've already set up. It will, because I'm running within the Angular CLI application, it knows that I'm part of that. So I'm going to go ahead and it's going to use ngserve under the hood to serve up. And it's just going to tell Angular CLI, the app that I want you to target is the one called Playground, and then it'll run it. So I've actually got two sessions running here. I've got one to serve up the actual app through ngserve, and then one that's serving up the Playground. So I'm able to have these two running at the same time, right, underneath the same project structure. So from here, I'm like, okay, I'm ready to start making sandboxes for components and start seeing them in the Playground. And the Playground basically has this, so the idea of the Playground is that it gives you a way to work on an individual component in isolation, with the concept being that, like, you're building a component, and it works for directives and pipes as well. So you're building one of these things, and you're like, I know that's the thing I'm working on. I'm going to work on my app component right now. So the Playground is not a discovery tool to see an inventory of all my components that I have in my app. It's more of a developer tool. So we wanted to keep this UI very minimal, so it gets right to the development of these components. One of the biggest things that it kind of focuses on is the concept that when you have an application and you start building this application out, and the example I like to use is, let's say you have a customer management application, and you're working this application, and it comes time to create a component for a shipping item, right? And you're like, okay, I want to work this component. These components have this concept of things in isolation, the style, the HTML, the logic. So they fit perfectly. There's their own little scope of piece. So I should be able to work on that. Well, because I'm rendering it within the context of my app, I actually have to launch my app, and then I have to navigate to a customer that has orders, that has shipments, that has line items, that has a line item that fits the scenario that I'm building in order to see my component in action in the browser, right? And this becomes really painful for us as developers, because especially we have scenarios like we have preset data, for our particular application, the seed data, and maybe that seed data doesn't have a customer with an order with that line item. So now we got to either update our seed data, and then we also have to launch our app and wait for it to reload to get to and navigate to that spot to just see our component in action in the browser, right? And you can start thinking about when you're going to make changes and you have this live reload going on for your application, you go into this shipment item component, and you're making a change to a style, or you're adding a new element in there, and you save your file, and the browser does a live reload. Well, now it's got to, when it live reloads, it's rebootstrapping your entire application. So however long that takes, you're going to wait for that just to see your changes, right? So there's this friction as our applications get bigger of working on these individual components, and that's what this is trying to solve. So we have this case here, like this app component here, that I believe I have a sandbox for. So the idea is that you launch the Playground, and then there's a shortcut key. It tells you right here. You can do Control-O or F1, and that will open up this slide down tray that then you basically type in the name of the component that you've sandboxed. And I think that I have app one in here, app component, and so it has this fuzzy search, but really, like, it's helpful, but you think in terms of, I know the one that I'm working on. So actually over here in the code, I've got this app component sandbox, and let's jump into that. So I know I'm going to be working on my app component. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to bring this tray down. I'm going to search for app component because that's the one I'm working on. Then I'm going to click on that and load that up, right? Now I'm ready to work on that individual one. So I guess I should pause really quick. Does anybody have any questions as I go on? Or if you guys do, just jump in and shout it out. Let me know.
That was perfect timing because I was just shouting out a question and then I realized I was muted again. So when you pick out, I just want to make sure I understand. So we're looking at this app.component.sandbox, right?
Mhm.
So, and you have that playground folder. So like say that you wanted to, and it's probably not easy to do this on the fly. The longer you stay here, the more challenging questions we'll ask you. But like say you wanted to isolate a different component, how easy is it to switch from one component to another in this playground that you've got set up? What would you like? Would you just change the template right here in the file you're looking at on line 6? Would you just change it there, or would you?
Yeah, let's go through that. I'll answer that question for sure here. So
good. You're answering all the questions.
Okay, so this is how you're gonna use it, right? So you have this concept of you're gonna sandbox your components or directives or pipes, right? And what you're doing is you're saying the playground has a API that has this sandbox of function. So you're gonna get a hold of that and you're gonna export default sandbox up. You're gonna make us. It's gonna look for .sandbox.ts files throughout your application, basically throughout wherever you told it the source. So I've got this Angular playground config file, and I'm telling it the source root that I want you to look at is the source directory, and that's this directory here. So anything from here on down, if it finds any .sandbox.ts files, it's going to process it on a watch and build out this dynamic file called sandboxes.ts. And so you'll want to git ignore this sandboxes.ts because it's dynamically built each time as you go throughout that. But basically, the playground CLI, when you run Angular Playground, will watch for .sandbox.ts files and watch all the changes in your application. And as it does, it'll rebuild the sandboxes file. And that's what the playground uses to digest all of the components and scenarios that are available to it. So it's building this file on the fly for you. And so all you really end up doing is you go, okay, now I just need to start putting .sandbox.ts files wherever in that source directory, and this thing's gonna pick them up. So I can make as many as I want. I can make them wherever I want. I typically go and create, when I sandbox a particular component or directive, I'll usually make it right next to it, same way as you might do with a spec file for unit testing.
Right.
It's really similar to unit testing, in the same sort of kind of concept or the vein that you're just displaying it in the browser. You're working in the browser, right?
So when you jumped over to that playground view on the left and you had that little box pop up and you had app component, if you had 3 different sandbox.ts files, you'd have 3 choices in that or 4 or 5, however. So one for every sandbox.ts you have in the project.
Yeah, so let's just go in here and let's do this real quick here. So I'm actually going to create a new directory. I'm just going to call this directory my sandboxes. Sandboxes. I would probably add this to my git ignore, so I'm not checking these in. And so this is going to be like my sandbox of sandboxes for myself, right? So I'm like, okay, I'm just going to start making a sandbox file in here to sandbox a component. And sometimes I'll do this and I'll say, I talk about like time to component, right? How fast can I build a component and get it displaying and see it in action and start working with it? Well, I can use the playground to do that because I don't even need a host, component file or any of that stuff. I could just create a sandbox TS file in here. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to do, how about we say hello.sandbox TS. Okay, and then so
you're gonna sandbox a component that you haven't even built yet?
Yes.
Oh, that's cool.
So I'm gonna build the component in here and sandbox it all in this one file. So the concept with the sandbox TS file is that we're gonna export a call to that sandbox of function, and we're gonna export that as default, and then the playground will know how to pick that up and process that. So it really starts with, well, actually in this scenario, I'm gonna say, okay, I wanna just build a component, right? Component. And I'm gonna do some of this here. Whoops. Been working on the PC all, well, yeah, look at this. I've been working on the PC all day, so I gotta remember what my shortcut keys are for the Mac here. Okay. I'm gonna create this component, right? I'm gonna get a selector. Let's just do it app. Oh, and I'm gonna give it a template. And let's say, hey, ngHouston. Go Rockets, right? You guys Rockets fans?
Yes, we are.
I know.
You're not allowed to live in Houston unless you're a Rockets fan.
A little bum my boy Westbrook's out of the playoffs. I don't get to watch him anymore, but Houston just had too much firepower. So
I'm not a Rockets fan.
All right, all right. Who's your team?
Cleveland.
Okay, okay. Well, they're a fun watch. That's for sure.
Go Sacramento Kings.
Kings, okay. All right.
Oh my goodness, you Houston people are killing me.
I'm not from Houston. That's probably the #1 problem.
That's probably. All right, I was born in Michigan, so I'm a big University of Michigan fan. Chris Webber, and so his days on the Kings were pretty amazing.
So close to a championship.
Close, so close. Dang, Lakers got in the way.
Yeah, so far away.
Yeah, so far away, right? All right, so I got this. I'm gonna give this component a class, right? Hello component. I don't need to export it because I'm just doing it in line here. Did I do that right? Okay. So now I'm ready to sandbox this thing. So I'm gonna export default. I'm gonna do sandbox of. I'm gonna make a sandbox of this component. So I'm gonna gotta import this. Sandbox of hello component. Okay. And now there's a couple different things I can do here, and we'll go through
How
these.
did you just do that? You clicked on something like magical, and it put an import statement in there. Did I imagine that?
That's one of the reasons why I love WebStorm right now is because as I typed it, it identified it, right? And then when I tabbed through it, it auto imported it for me. But in this, actually in this case, not for the hello component though. The hello component's right here. So I didn't need to do that. So it was identifying as I typed that I have a hello component in this folder structure somewhere, right? In this case, right here. So it helped with the autocomplete essentially at that point.
I don't think VS Code does that I know of.
It's a new feature in VS Code. So get the latest. It'll do that too.
Keith, will you tweet that later if you can find something for it?
Sure. It was in my my part of the talk at our meetup last week too.
Yeah. So I don't catch everything that goes on, but sometimes I see something. I'm like, oh, I got to learn that too. Yeah, but that's cool. Sorry, Justin.
That's all right. That's all right. No problem. Okay, so I'm making a call to this sandbox of function, and the sandbox of function has a fluent interface. So it's going to return an object that has a function on it that function call will return the same object, so I can chain things. And that's what we talk about with the fluent interfaces. Usually it's this, you know, kind of like when you do observables and you can do ... off of that sort of thing. It's this, I can just do it all in one line. So I've got this, not one line, but one chain. So I got this call to sandbox of, that's sandboxing this hello component. And now I'm going to do a call to add a scenario. I'm going to give a nickname for the scenario. So let's say plain text here, right? And that's going to be the name of the scenario. And so the add function takes a string to name that scenario, and then it's going to take an object, a configuration object that has one requirement, and that's template. Now it has other properties on that you can pass in, and we'll go over those in a minute here. But by the most minimum thing is you need a template. And what's going to happen here is we're essentially what we're doing when we're sandboxing, we're creating a host component. So it's like at this point we're like creating the parent component where our component's going to be rendered in, right? Again, or our directives or our pipes. So because of that, now we can write the markup for this essential like host component or parent component, and we just simply write an element for our component. So at this point we've got app hello. Right? And so now we've got this app hello component that's going to render inside of this host component, and we're kind of good to go here at this point. So now we can go back over to the playground here, and again, I'm tied in through Angular CLI and the serve and the watch and everything. So I've got this auto reload happening for me, this auto rebuild and reload for me. And again, it's rebuilding the code in our application, right? Based on Angular CLI and that whole setup. So as you change components, as you change pieces of any files in your system that affect that, it will handle rebuilding and reloading the playground for you. Because again, it's all built on your build system, not some playground's own build system. The only thing that Playground builds is that sandbox, discovering those sandbox files and rebuilding that sandbox's file so it can dynamically load your components as you change them. So now over here, I'm going to pull up our UI here. I'm going to go back out, and we've got the name of a hello component. So I'm just going to hello component, and now I've got that in the list, right? And so it's finding the names of the components that you've sandboxed. So basically this hello component that's over there on the side, that's the name of my component. So it's created a key based on that. And whenever we type, we're finding that. So I could go in here and say something like component, and now I see them both because it's doing this fuzzy search, right? But again, I know what component I'm working on. I'm working on the hello component. So really all I need here is just a way to get to that really quickly, right? Hello component. And then what I really care about is the scenarios. In this case, I named it plain text. So I've got a plain text scenario in here, right? I go to that and I've got my component there. So now I can really start going with this thing, and I can start saying, okay, well, I want to add another scenario. So I can use this Fluent interface right here and say, let's say I want to copy this thing and create another one. And let's go off of our concept of theming and stuff. And let's say this component is going to support a host context of a theme that's going to make the font bigger so we can actually see it in this screen here, right? So let's say big theme.
I was just thinking about that when Keith was talking earlier about the different colors and allowing people to do different colors. I was thinking this would be perfect for testing something like that because you're passing it in, right? Right.
So let's do this. Let's go. We're going to come up here to our component, and we're going to add a styles property to our component metadata. And this allows us to create an array of styles that we can inline here. I'm going to add one in here. I'm going to make use of host context. Actually, I'll just make use of host. We can do that for this scenario here. And I'm going to say big. And what this selector is doing is it's going to say the host element, which in this case is going to be app hello. If it's got a class on it by the name of big, then I want to apply the styling, and let's do font size.
Hey, Justin, I hadn't looked at that before. That host, that's been around for a while. We just didn't know it.
Right, the host and the host context, and then Angular will handle shimming that for us with this CSS mode that it does out of the box. So you know, it's something that works with web components, and then it'll shim it for us if we're not running like native elements, and so it allows us to kind of use both scenarios. So yeah.
So I think that's really cool, and it's easy to miss. Can you say that one more time? Because I know we have a couple of beginners that might not have seen that before. So that little host, that's like a CSS thing, and when you call that, then you're looking at the element that you're inside of, and if it has that class, then it will apply that.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yeah, and so it's really, when the host, we're talking about the thing that this thing is targeting. So in this case, it's in a custom element with app hello as the name of it, right? If we were to use this selector, if we were to make an attribute selector, then host would be whatever you put that attribute selector on, right? So it's really the target container for that element. The thing that you end up putting elsewhere in a parent component somewhere, really, is the thing to think about. And so now I can come into this big theme, right? And I can add class called big. And I haven't tried this yet, so I'm just hoping that live coding goes great, and we'll find out, right? So now I got this. Did it save? Rebuild. It's going to reload. And see, so now over here in the playground, like this thing's reloading, right? All the playground has in it is 2 components to render the dropdown and render the selected component. Try and keep it as lightweight, as minimal as possible for the actual playground code, so that it stays out of the way, because again, this is a development tool that we want to be able to sandbox and work our components in a rapid pace. We don't want anything else getting in the way. That's why we want to sandbox them, is because we don't want the whole bloat of our application when we just work on these components. So the whole Playground UI is built around, it was inspired a lot by React Storybook. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but it's this tool that came out that allows you to kind of discover and see all of your components that are built in React in one spot. But it relies heavily a lot on this discovery mechanism. It has a menu on the side where you can see all your components, and you can kind of click through, and you're kind of like taking inventory of your component library and seeing them run in isolation. And with this, with the Playground, I want it really to be something that's solving the problem of, you know, the exact component you're working on. This is really not for somebody to come in later and say, well, what components does my application have? And there's actually a way to do that with leveraging Playground, and I can talk about that near the end. But the Playground itself is like awesome dev experience for, you know, the component you're working on. You want to work that thing without any other distractions and get right to it. And part of that story is about the reload of the browser as we make these changes. It's reloading the browser. So how much work does it have, Angular does it have to do to get you back to component on the screen? And so we keep that as minimal as possible. So
do you know
that
who built this Playground?
What's up?
Do you know off the top of your head who built this?
I built it.
You built this?
I built it.
Well, I'm gonna have to start being nicer to you.
And I worked with, I took input and stuff from people at my work and team that I work with to kind of, I initially built it as rendering an individual sandbox scenario, like sandboxing one file. So you'd have this dynamic file, kind of just like what I did right here with this My Sandboxes folder. I would create my own file, and I would sandbox a component, and then I would ready to sandbox a different component. I would edit this file, and I would just not check it into my repository, right? And then people started doing the same thing, and they started saving their files because they wanted to save these different scenarios. And so I'm like, okay, we need a way to save scenarios across the board, right? To make this thing that works with multiple components, multiple scenarios, that you could actually check these files in or commit them and have them as part of your repository. So over time, when somebody goes to refactor this component later, they could pull it up in the Playground and look the scenarios, make their change, and make sure it works in all the different scenarios, right? So
now I understand why Keith wanted you to tell us about this. I didn't even realize, you've been talking about this whole time. I didn't realize you built this.
Cool.
That's pretty cool, man.
So now if I go in here and I go to my big theme, sweet, we got, you know, we see the big theme one being applied, that scenario. We can switch back and go to the plain text one. And now we really see it in both scenarios, both cases, right? And we can start going and building as many scenarios as we want, chaining these things together to fit all of our needs of what we want to see this thing in. And you can think of this in terms of, say you have an address component, and an address component, you want to make sure it renders fine. So you have a concept of like a billing and shipping address, and a shipping address usually has an attention to field, and a billing address doesn't, right? And you want to make sure your component will correctly hide the attention to when it's not part of the data and show it when it's there. You could sandbox those different scenarios, feed it the different data, and see it in action without having to worry about your seed data of your application, finding a customer that has that information in that scenario. It's really easy to do. And we can do that with things on here off of this add function. Then the second parameter, this object, it takes in several other properties that you can send in. So I'm going to jump over here to the definition of these guys here, these two interfaces. So these two at the top here, this sandbox of config and this scenario config, these are the blueprints of what you can send into these options. So the scenario config is for our scenarios, for that add method. And we saw we passed in the template property. We could also do styles. And what this is so this footprint is really similar to our component metadata that we put on it. And again, we're working with a host component that's like a parent component. So these styles would be the styles that we want to apply to the parent component that's rendering that template. So if we have cases where we want to, you know, stage this thing when the parent component has a class on it or has a certain look on it, we can leverage the styles to put that on that parent component and mimic the places that this component is going to land in our application. The second one, the third one over here is this context. And the context, what the context is it represents that parent component class. And so you think in terms of, if my parent component has a property on it called address, and that's where that data lives, I could set that using this context property, give it an object literal, and give it a property in there called address, and I could set that up to whatever it is, and that will become a property on that host component named address that now I can use in the view or in the template. And then providers provides you a way to put a service and provide that into that host component that now my sandbox component can leverage. And I would use that in turn cases where I want to mock out a service. So let's say my component is going to use an address service to verify an address, right? That maybe it's a form and this component takes in an address service that is going to reach out to an HTTP call to verify an address. And I want to sandbox that component, but I don't want it to actually make the HTTP call out. Same way if I was writing a unit test for it, I would not want it to actually make the HTTP call. I just want to confirm that that was called and that some data came back. So I could use as providers to send in a mock representation of that service and then totally control what it does. So like in the case of, let's say, an address loading, I could replace the address service with a mock address service that for one scenario returns back an address with an attention to, and for another scenario returns it without it. And now I can actually see it, how it's going to handle that data that's given to it. So let's go real quick over here and see if we can implement some of these things here. So,
hey Justin, one question real quick on the providers. So on a project that's using NgRx store, since we've hit on that a few times here, so where you're using the store service throughout the application to grab that global state, that would be another scenario where you would want to use the providers to mock out the store and just feed in the portion of the state that component's using. Does that sound right?
Hey, Reggie, I think you muted. Why are you muting people? Reggie muted.
Yeah,
Justin.
I just saw that I was muted. I don't know how much of that you got, but it looks like you're starting to actually work the question that I was asking about, though.
Hey, Reggie, can you unmute Justin? How do you?
I got myself muted too. I'm sorry, I'm trying to figure it out right now.
They can unmute themselves.
Oh.
I'm trying to unmute Justin and it won't let me because Reggie muted him.
Only Justin can unmute Justin.
how about now?
There we go. There we go.
Sorry about that.
Okay,
You're a troublemaker, Reggie.
Okay, so yes, I could come in here and go providers, and I don't have all the pieces in here right now, but it's going to look something like this. So I could provide and tell it store. Let's say I actually was able to import the store, and I'm going to say use class and mock store, right?
Okay.
So now, then in this component, if this component, in the constructor took in store, and called store.select, and at that point, my mock store select would get called, right? So now I could completely mock that out and have this run, this particular scenario right here, be the one that uses the mock store. This other scenario would use the actual store, right?
Got it.
So yeah,
that's cool. I have one other. This is kind of a diverting the topic a little bit, but before actually, if you could undo that last delete there.
And I think we only have a few more minutes. We're gonna have to wrap it up because I think Justin, you have a hard stop in about 10 minutes, don't you, Justin?
I probably have, it's 6:20 right now, 8:20. I have probably about 20 more minutes, 30 more minutes.
All right.
I could go.
All right.
Oh, sorry, this is just
I have
going
too
to
much fun with the sandbox and the
I know,
and
this is
playground.
pretty
So
cool.
I got more
I
stuff to
didn't
show
even know
you.
about this. I wanted you to come and talk about components, and I didn't even know about it. And now I'm like really excited about this. This is cool.
Cool. Okay, so what's your question real quick? Throw that in. Let's see what
yeah, this is just a quick one. I see that the way that you structured the provider there looks very similar to how you might mock a provider in a unit test.
Mm-hmm.
I usually use value rather than use class.
Okay.
I'm assuming use class is available over in unit tests as well, and it'll just new up that particular class. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And
That's
same
cool.
way throughout your application too, yeah. Because usually when you do this providers provide in the context of your application, it's usually to do like values, right? You don't.
Yeah.
It's not too often that you use class in your application, but in unit testing, certainly, yeah. And it's again the same sort of concept, right? It's real similar to unit testing. And provide a way to replace that thing for this particular run. So, yep, you're correct.
That's cool. Thanks.
Cool. Sure. Okay, so context. Let's do this here. Actually, I'm going to add a new one because we can do that. So I'm just going to add another scenario, and let's add a new feature to this thing. Let's add an input. One of my favorite things about this is like I'm just creating this component in the sandbox file in my sandboxes, and I'm really able to start prototyping and work a component without taking the overhead of where am I going to put it in my application tree? Where's it going to live? You know, is it going to be a global component? Is it going to be this? I can just get right to creating my component right now and feeling that process out, and then make those decisions later. It's super fun. So I'm going to import this input. Let's give it name. How about that? Be real creative here. And then let's go into our component. Go Rockets. Let's give it a strong, and we'll do name. Now we got our typical thing where we're going to have our name, you know, provided via an input. We can come in here and do another scenario. We can call this with name. And now we can make use of the context for this host component or parent component context. I'm going to give it an object, literal, and that's going to be just like the instance of this kind of object or the class we're thinking about. And I'm going to give it a, let's do, to make it a little more clear, I'll go call it my name. And we'll go. And now over here in our template for here, I'm just going to do a regular input binding as if I'm implementing this component, right? I'm going to do name and I'm going to do my name. Okay, so now I can come over here, wait for this to reload. Bring up our component. We've got our new with name in here. I can go to that, and now I've got my name in here, right? I still have the class big on here, so really probably should change this to be with name and big theme scenario, right? Or I could keep this with name and get rid of this and say the only thing I want this component to be at this scenario is just with the name, right? And I save it, wipe that thing out. It's going to reload. Bam! I'm back to seeing it in action with that scenario right away, right? So we could also do things like, you know, again, this context is basically going to merge these properties into the host component and become like properties and methods on that host component or that parent component. So if we wanted to have this case where this thing was, we wanted to say, how could we bind up? We want to bind an output. Let's do that. Let's do output. And we can do, let's do a, excited. Just because I don't want to use click, but I'm going to kind of bind it like click, right? So I'm going to do this output of excited. I get myself in this scenario here. I'm going to do, this actually has to be a new event emitter. I'm partially going off the assumption that this looks familiar to people, that we're making an output that has an event emitter, and then I'm going to say, let's say when I click on the name, so this will be good. So we're going to do a click event, bind a click event of our little name container, and we're going to say excited emit. And so now it's going to wire up that output. So if we click on the strong or the name, we're going to emit this event out of our component. And now down here with this with name, we could say with name and click, or let's just leave it with name. And now we're going to bind up to this app hello, which has excited. And we're going to wire up to on click. How about that? Now we need to make this on click method. So we come in here and we're just going to add it to this context on click. All right. And we're going to say that's a function. And what do we want to do? We want to alert it. I don't like to alert. That's console log. From playground B. Okay. All right. So again, we're thinking in terms of we're writing the parent component where we're going to implement our component usage. So now we're putting properties and methods on our parent component by using this context that we can use within our template for that parent component, right? So now over here, let me bring up the dev tools. And get out of this view here. Okay, so now if I increase the font down here so you can see the ever exciting click. And I'm hoping this works. Click. Cool. Click from playground, right? So now we've wired up all this kind of like usage and interaction in our sandbox with these different scenarios for our components. Now we can really start working these things without being inside of our app, without having to have, you know, again, what we've done here, right? We have this host component for free for us. Like if we did this within the context of our app, and we created this new component, we would have to not only create the file for the component, figure out where we're going to put it in our tree, but then we also have to implement it in some other parent component. So we would typically maybe go to our app component and throw it in there just temporarily and then have to remember not to commit that file and stuff like that, right? This helps us with that development cycle because we do that within here. We don't have to really touch our main application and dirty it up just to see some stuff in action, and we can really craft this thing on the fly here. Sound pretty cool?
Yeah. I see the obvious really good application for this is when you're designing a component or trying to get it to look like your intended design. But it seems like another good application for this would be to actually just test your components to make sure that they're functioning the way that you intend.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. And especially from a visual aspect, right? Like you want to make sure that this class big is always going to make that font a certain size, right? And so you have this way to audit that and come back to this playground and look at these things to make sure that like, oh yeah, we changed some other styling. Did it affect that? If I came in here and I changed this font size for this particular internal workings, is that going to play nice with that, right? I just switch it to that scenario and I can visually see, oh yeah, I kind of hosed that because I didn't do that. So now I can tweak it and fix it and solve that problem. So definitely.
I needed this a year ago because I was working on a really large application and it was a kind of a live WebRTC thing. And every time I was trying to do something inside of a live session, it's like several steps to get to it. And then when I change something and then refresh the whole page and I have to click like 4 things to get into the scenario I want so I can see what I'm working on.
Yep.
I needed this. I love this.
Thanks. That's like the biggest use case for it that really drove it. That initial concept of it was this need of going, look, that having sample data and having sample stuff and the need to navigate to it just to work on these things is that's the challenge, right, we face, and then that's a barrier to our development cycle. And so this is really trying to solve that and make it, and because we live in this component world now, which we talked earlier about some of the struggles and some of the things we have to think about and the challenges that we face because we have to live in this world, like here's some of the benefits, right, is the fact that because we can build these little isolated chunks, we could also dev around those, and we can now rapidly work our application. We can ensure the integrity of it over time, all these things, because we have this component world that we're living in that allows us to do these sort of things. So it's pretty cool. So a couple other things here real quick. So we looked at the properties that we could send into this object setting that we can send into the add method, which the add is for adding a scenario. We can also send in stuff to the sandbox of method, which is sandboxing the component. And that's things like prepend text. So this tray that we bring up, this command bar that we bring up here, I can remember the shortcut keys here. It's taking the name of the component and rendering that out as this header of this piece, right? And then that's what we're searching on. But the prepend text allows us to prepend text to that name. So if you have a case where you have hello component in 2 features in your application, right? Well, they're going to both surface as, it'll know that they're 2 separate ones, but you'll see 2 hello components in here. Actually, let's just go into here and I'll make this happen real quick. So if I come in here and I change this to app component, I would use the refactoring, but I forget the shortcut key on the Mac, so I'm not. I'll just copy paste here. But if I come back in here and I bring this thing up, maybe I've discovered a bug here. I was expecting to, oh, no, I didn't. I got to search for app component, right? Now, see, it knows there are 2 different types. I've got 2 app components, but now I've got this, which one do I pick, right? And in this case, it's kind of obvious because I know the different scenarios, but what if these were both default, right? Or not, I would have to click on each one to find out. So the prepend text is really like to come in here and go, okay, well, I'm going to give this differentiator. So prepend text, and I'll call it my dot. How about that? I'm missing something here. Oh, missing my comma. Okay, so now save that. Come back in here and I've got my app component and app component, right? So it allows me to group those things. So you can think about in terms of if I have feature A and feature B, maybe my prepend text would be feature A and feature B for the other one. And then I could leverage that fuzzy search as well to go like my comp, my app, whatever. And now filter just to the one, which is not such a big deal. Again, the thought process in using this command bar is like, what component you're working on. So you're not really using it for discovery. You already know what you're going to type in here. And so it's just that if you ended up saying, I'm working on the app component, well, now I maybe want to make that a little easier for me. So now I could do the prepend text and filter that out. So that's what prepend text does. Then we've got some other things on here that, go back to it here. And so the rest of these properties, imports, declarations, providers, those, if you look closely, what those represent are just like our ng module metadata, right? And that's because when we're sandboxing this component, now we can leverage this object to configure things on like a module level. So if we want to import, if our component uses a shared module, we could put an imports on there and bring that shared module in here. Or if our component uses reactive forms, right? We got to bring in the reactive forms module from Angular. So we use the imports to bring that in. So it allows us to solve that case, to bring that in for our sandbox components. Same thing with declarations. If your component has child components that it uses, you have to provide them with this declarations because, or you have to bring in an ng module that does that for you. Because again, the sandbox, nothing's given for you. It's just raw. It's you're sandboxing that component. If that component has dependencies, you have to declare those. And it's real similar to the unit testing sort of thing. So same thing with providers.
Justin, you would if you're going to declare those, you would declare those right there in the sandbox.ts file?
To begin with, yes. Yes. And then, you know, as that plays out, as you start sandboxing things more over time and figuring out what these patterns are and stuff, you may end up declaring them in different places. You maybe have some helper things, or maybe you need to bring it in from another module, and that's where it's declared at. But let's just kind of see this real quick in action here. I can do this real quick, and I can go. Mixing my, okay, cool. Mixing my emit, which is a shortcut for creating components, and a markup with my actual one. Okay, there we go. Okay, so let's say I've got this form in here that I just have some more. This is bigger, rich form I fill out or whatever, and my app component in here needs to leverage, let's say, just regular template-driven forms. And so I could do, actually, let's do this. Let's do, okay, so I'm expecting that as this saves and reloads, I'm going to get an error here. Assuming I'm on the component. Am I on the component? I've got to select the component. Okay, so another cool thing about the playground is, like, it's dynamically loading your components. So you're not, you sandbox 40 components in your application. The playground's not actually processing and loading all those 40 components. It's only loading them when you go to them. So that's another thing that helps out with this development cycle, right? Is in your application, if you have 200 components, you're waiting for the bootstrap of all those 200 components each time your browser reloads. But with the playground, it just reloads the playground component, and then any component that you've already selected, right? So now it's just a lot more rapid to get to working on these things. But in this case here, I've got a problem because I'm trying to use ngModel, but it doesn't know about it. Angular doesn't know about it because I didn't bring that thing in. So what I really end up needing to do is I need to come in here and make use of the imports, because I've done that somewhere in my application. I've imported forms module, right, in order for that to work. If I wasn't building this component in line here in the sandbox file, if I actually was a component in my application somewhere, it's, you know, probably getting the forms module from my main app module higher up, and kind of like magic, right? But as soon as we sandbox it, we realize this component has a dependency on that forms module, because I was getting it for free from somewhere else. But now if I want to run it over here, I need that. So if I was ever to take this component out and use it in another project or somewhere else, like, this identifies like what is needed in that other project if I was going to do that, right? And I think I actually have this just checking error. I really need to be, let's see. I think I just need to implement some more stuff for my component. But essentially now, you know, now I'm getting errors related to form stuff in Angular, because now I have the right dependency that I had to provide in here. Now I just need to write my form correctly up here. But you can kind of see how that kind of plays out, right? So I'll back out of that real quick. And then same thing with, like, again, with declarations and stuff like that. So it's really kind of, you're simulating an ng module at this point at your sandbox level, and then you're simulating component metadata at the add scenario level. And that's how that kind of plays out. And then you can do things like that providers that I showed you earlier on the scenario level. I could do the providers at the sandbox of level, and then every scenario would be receiving what I declared in there. So if I wanted to mock out a service and use that same mock for all of my scenarios, I could just do it up here. I wouldn't have to do it at each add, because that's going to trickle down. Make sense?
Yes.
Cool. Okay, so questions. I think that's getting close to time. So questions about Playground, anything else on this? Like,
Well, I think I speak for all of us when I say this is very cool. I did not know about this. I mean, I already thought you were cool, but I didn't know you built this. So I'm pretty excited about this. I didn't even know, and I feel like this is crazy because I haven't stumbled across this. There's so much that I'm trying to absorb after NgConf. There's so many things. I was all excited about NgRx and RxJS, and I still am, but now I'm excited about this because I'm going to go use this like tomorrow.
cool.
This is very cool, Justin.
Thanks. I get super excited from a dev standpoint every time I'm working on components and I'm using this thing. It's just, I don't know, for me, it's just so fun because it's, you know, you can just start working on these components and you don't have all this other stuff going on. And now you can really like dial that component in and make it clean and make it effective, and then see those scenarios and then stage that data. I mean, the data thing's a big thing that we run into, right? With having to have the sample data and pulling up in our app. And it's just so easy here to do that. You know, I could come in here and I could put a scenario with long name and put my full name in here and make sure that that still renders correctly when the user has a long name versus a short name, right? And it's really easy for me to do these sort of things and see it visually. So it's just like unit testing. We can do those things real easily in unit testing and confirm code still works. But here we do it visually in our component rendering in the browser, and we can work those different scenarios out. And it's just like, it becomes real easy to do these cases and these scenarios and work your component and know it's got coverage of all those cases that you need without having to go through all these hoops and stuff that we usually have to do. So
yeah, and especially like if you have different permission levels, and depending on your permission levels, you might see elements or buttons that other people don't see. And
right.
This is like perfect for that kind of stuff. Where were you a year? I needed this a year ago. This is cool. Yeah, there are so many places to use this. I love this.
Cool.
That's
one
cool.
of the things that worked for a while on was the commitment to the CLI, to really make it work with the CLI. It's dynamically loading these components. So it's not something that's like running under an AOT build or anything. Like, it needs to use the compiler right now from Angular. But it also needs to like dynamically load these things. And so getting that to work and play nice in this Angular CLI took a while, but finally figured that out and solved that. And so you can do it with the CLI, you can do it with your own build process. There's some documentation on what you need to do for that up on the site and get it kind of going. So
that's
cool.
Beautiful. I love it. I really appreciate you showing that. I'm glad. Keith just had a drop a few minutes ago, but he wanted us to thank you for him, and I'm gonna have to go thank him for finding this and asking you, because I didn't even ask you to come and talk about this. I didn't even know. Now I'm excited. It's a good thing we had Keith.
Component thing, right? It plays into as we architect our components and we're thinking about this decoupling and reusability of our components. Well, this helps to discover that. Again, this helps to see what your dependencies are in your component. As soon as you sandbox that thing, you'll see right away, I got errors. What did I not bring in? And so how coupled did I make my component, or how much does it rely on these things? And then things like you go and you build a component, again, for like, you're building it in your app and you want to use it in 2 places, but the part that you have it in your app right now is within this one container component that forces it down to a size. And so you build for that because you're seeing that, and then you put it over this other place and it totally just changes the look of it. And now you have to handle that case. And you go and you write the code for that, but now you also have to make sure you don't break the other case. And now you have to bring up the app twice in order to see it in action, 2 things. But now with Playground, you can stage those scenarios, work that out, and get it all dialed in ahead of time. So it really solves a lot of that component architecture challenge and things that we face. So
that was awesome. That was a very good. You are welcome to come back and hang out with our meetup group anytime.
Sweet.
That was a really good talk, and I really appreciate you coming and hanging out with us tonight.
No problem. No problem. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Thanks for all the questions too, and discussing. I love talking shop with everybody and helping people out. So I'm glad you guys came with questions and stuff.
Yeah, this was fun. Well, thank you, and thanks to the panel. And I hate to bring it to a close because this was really cool, but we're out of time. So thanks again.
Cool. We'll plan another time. I'll come back again for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. Next week. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, we'd love to have you back. This was fun.
Cool. Thanks everyone.
Justin.
Thank you.
Thank you, man. Thank you so
Justin.
much.
Totally. Anytime.